Seasons swept by as Belegar brooded within the restored settlement of Carrick-Bufnar, yet haunted by the spectre of his father and the words he spoke to him. The Angrund realm was struggling to maintain its foothold, as it were, and there was a need for a leader with a vision to direct the operations of what Derby that remained. Shale and granite cliffs shone with a dull glow in the evening air, misty with fumes from the labour of thirsty forges. Belegar strode outside to be greeted by one of his most trustworthy engineers, a young but eager dwarf with a smear of ash across his ruddy features.
Still trying to figure out how to ease your father's ghostly demands without forsaking your people.
Something of the sort. Though my mother always told me that the living should not heed the dead. Much to the chagrin of the priest of Gasul, of course.
Aye, there's wisdom to that. Perhaps if I may, your grace, the counsel of mighty Lund may be more prophetic than reasonable. Who knows how a restless death might addle the senses?
Your words are brash and bold, but there is sense to them nonetheless. I would ask you to weigh your words with more care, though. Not so much that I shall be without them.
The engineer gave a chuff of good humour before he offered a nod of understanding. To not heed the words of erstwhile King Lun without question was a very unconventional thing to do. But then again, the dwarf was dead, and a new king had taken his seat, one that all had to trust in these dark times. A ranger approached, one well known to the king. Dunrill Whitehall had seen his share of bloody labour across the vault, where they now resided. How many times he had seen the Urks steal away with dwarven treasures could not be told, but ever since the rebuilding of Carrick-Bufnar, he had been restless. Now the ranger walked with a lively step, and the slightest of smiles creasing his lips.
News, your majesty, from Carrick-Herne. King Alaric Ranulfson has sworn allegiance to the Angrund banner and wishes to support our campaign. He's on his way already with the throne.
The ranger's eyes glittered with glee as he spoke. Carrick-Herne, the Hornhold, was a great and steadfast ally to the Angrund, holding dominion over the mountains south of the Manling Empire and the Black Mountains. Its namesake owed to the cavernous tunnels leading through its hold that drafted the roaring gales of the peaks through its bowels, to produce, with the release of a mechanism, such thunderous blowing that it sent trolls tumbling from the mountainside, and lesser beasts fleeing, no doubt imagining some vast giant to ward over the cliffs. In a sense, such a giant existed, in the shape of King Alaric himself, for he was amongst the largest of dwarfs, and with his feathered helmet he stood as tall as a manling. Arranged now before Belegar stood the warriors of Carrick-Herne in their moss-green uniforms, holding aloft the great banner of a horn, from which hung two great troll skulls. Added now to Belegar's forces was a grudge thrower, a dwarven catapult of exquisite make, lobbing boulders carved with runes of spite, as well as a regiment of thunderers with trustworthy rifles, and two additional regiments of warriors. 3 long days of feasting and celebration had taken place before the mustering, and in his drunken trust, the king had made arrangement for young Yngvar Stormhammer to hold Carrick-Bufnar in Belegar's absence, though much to the chagrin of King Alaric.
Not trust in engineers, for theirs is a craft aimed to replace honest work. I had one such fool come to me with a machine able to carve through stone in a day what would take 5 dwarfs a week. But how do we uphold tradition and keep the strength of our arms if we forsake the mining pick?
There was no right answer for Belegar to offer, nor should he. King Alaric's mind was set in stone, and had been for generations, as was the wont of his bloodline, to ever deny anything but the purest conventionalism. Belegar, however, considered it the privilege of those that could afford it to uphold tradition in the face of annihilation, and that he would have to use unconventional and even ruthless means to reach his goals. He only hoped that King Alaric would remain by his side for as long as possible. He offered a simple bow of his head and a grunt, before toasting the great dwarf. Quaffing ale was better than arguing. The army made its way for Carreg Isol, once one of the mightiest of Carrags, holding a wealthy array of iron and copper in its mountainous glory. Now for years it had been under the sway of the Broken Nose, and who knew how many dwarves were entrapped in the deepest of tunnels, yet fighting for their lives against the forces above. As always, Belegar preferred to make use of the great underways that had been dug under the Copper Mountains, and with his crew of miners he intended to breach his own way into the Carreg. However, during one foray into the depths, a startling discovery was made. The grim surprise which the Orcish warboss had mentioned earlier was found in one of the tunnels below, in the form of 100 dwarven refugees. They had been captured by the enemy, yet had not been slain, but instead had their eyes poked out and noses and beards rubbed from them, except for one that led them, though he had his fingers removed just for good measure. Now Belegar's forces were slowed down by having to care for 100 helpless Darwi, and Greenskin scouts would no doubt soon report on the dwarven army and Belegar's plans. A grim deal was struck with the survivors, of whom many longed for nothing more than vengeance, and armed with satchel charges, they were situated along underway tunnels to give up their lives in a suitable dwarven fashion during the many skirmishes that occurred in the following days. And those that refused their duties were offered nothing but a meal and directions for Carreg Bufdar, though whether they made it or not remained to be seen. King Alaric was not satisfied with the choices of Belegar to so forsake the helpless or damn them with a final dooming. But he remained, and that was all Belegar needed. Rushing through a fresh breach, Belegar's and Alaric's forces swept forth, charging for the distant walls. A cacophony of apish roars resounded from beyond, where the greenskin forces waited.
Let loose death upon them!
Orcish archers hurried for the parapet in a muddled confusion. The greenskin had expected the dwarfs, that was true, but where they would make their entry was entirely unknown. Or so it appeared. Dwarfs clambered onto the defiled stone to survey the lost city. Perfidious idols had been raised among sacred dwarven sites, in the shape of great masks of Gorg and Morg, the vile deities of strength and cunning of the greenskin. Heaps of dung filled the streets, and snotlings danced in the bones of dwarven dead, as goblins jeered and orcs blundered for the walls. Suddenly, shadows took shape, and from the ruined towers and beneath heaps of trash rose great black orcs decked in scrap metal. A dwarven warrior was lifted off his feet as a maul crunched through his shield and launched him off the wall with a terrible scream. Another dwarf gasped in horror just as he reached the top of the ladder, before another hammer fell down upon the top of his helmet with a metallic clunk, pressing it down over his head with a spurt of dark blood, the dwarf falling down onto his shouting comrades below like a broken toy. A monstrous ironclad black orc ambled forward, discarding a dwarf over the defences after flailing him by his beard above his head. This was no doubt the leader of the orcs, for he towered above them all. Goblins screamed with glee, zigzagging between the skirmishes to shank and dispatch the surprised dwarven warriors in the most unworthy of manners.
I still got some surprises left for you.
Alaric unwarded his shield bearers as they bore him forward upon the huge disc inlaid with the history of Carreg Hearn. He looked to the chaos before the wall he had been instructed to seize, but it seemed nigh impossible to reach the top. Great shadows of giants tussled with small shapes up there, discarding ladders and Darwi like it were some twisted game.
Knut! orcs on the walls! Halt the advance!
Upon Alaric's mark, the grudge thrower released its payload upon the walls, scattering the dumbstruck black orcs. And as soon as they rose to peer over the ruined masonry, a rain of quarrels followed in quick succession. Just as Alaric and his warriors began climbing the ladders, the bombardment ceased, buying them just enough time to reach the top unmolested. From the dust atop the wall arose the helm-winged form of Alaric, and he bore into the black orcs with his rune-edged axe, hewing through scrap iron and flesh as he left a path of red ruin and two disemboweled, wailing black orcs.
Who the suck are you?
Alaric gave no answer to the war boss, but strode confidently towards him, axe aloft and eyes aflame with anger. The orc's cleaver hammered in a horizontal blow for Alaric as he met the blade with his own enchanted steel, and with a sundering echo, the weapon was cloven, much to the surprise of the orc.
My chopper!
Smack! Alaric's fist crunched into the warboss's nose, then again, before the orc felt itself yanked down by its breastplate to receive a headbutt from the towering dwarf. The orc staggered drunkenly back, landing on a heap of goblins that yelped as they steadied their careening leader as one might a boxer in the ring.
You bore me, orc. Let your own kind sort you out.
A wide slash from Alaric saw the warboss's hands reduced to stumps in a bloody cloud, before the orc was kicked off the wall to land amongst a crew of bloodthirsty goblins. Seeing now their chance to get their taste of vengeance for the months of beatings at the hands of the orc, with a choking whine of misery, the former warboss met an untimely end, hardly worthy of its gods to acknowledge. At Belegar's front, the dwarven forces pushed further into the bowels of the city as grudge-thrower stones rained down upon the retreating Urk from above. Further and further Darwi spilled into the streets, hewing the greenskin in a dark silence of retribution. Only the most hardened of the orcs chose to stand and fight, and were met by shield wall after shield wall, occupying every street as the Karok was taken stone by stone. Belegar and his hammerers were determined to make a last decisive push for the center of the city, where they were met with a fierce resistance. But the Iron Brotherhood were unbowed, and their hammers fell as pistons upon the foe. A treacherous goblin shaman unleashed what warg energy he had managed to conjure, dispatching in the most cowardly fashion a trio of grey-bearded rangers, sending their ghosts to the stone in confusion. The cretin fled as best it could, but with every street occupied, and dwarfs along and hiding appearing from the shadows, it was seized by the Iron Brotherhood to face an agonizing death. Carrig Isor had been reclaimed.
Send in our hungry horrors, lads. Let them feast upon these land-loving man-children.
Aranessa's Saltspite had come to Chilea, and with her she brought an army of the greedy and downtrodden alike, filled with wretched buccaneers, both alive and undead. Never in their life had the defenders imagined to see their navy and forces bested by pirates, and now the rulers of Mirigliano rued their lax commitment to defending their home.
Sweep them away in the tide! Slash their bellies and dance in their entrails! Let us keel-haul these fools that hadn't slit their own throats.
Thank you guys for watching episode 2 of this series, and I'd like to try another format for episode 3 if there's an interest in seeing more. Maybe something that focuses more on battles and less on narration. I'd also like to thank Rise of Phoenix and Bug Smasher for their help with voicing some of the characters. And please let me know what you think and what you'd like to see more of on the channel. Take care out there.